Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Elly Truesdell. I'm the founder of New Fair Partners. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, cool. First, thank you to all of these amazing panelists for coming today. I'm so excited about this conversation. And thank you to Baldor for having us. I'm going to see how I do on this clicker. Neela knows I'm nervous about the clicker. So I'm not going to do introductions just because we only have 45 minutes, and as far as I'm concerned, this group needs no introduction, and really excited to get into the conversation today. But first, I'm just going to kick things off. The conversation today is about the modern eater and the shifting American palate. And I've been thinking about this a lot recently just because I did spend 10 years at Whole Foods overseeing the Emerging Brands program. And when I reflect on those years, 2008 to 2017, and I think about what was considered exciting or disruptive or innovative at the time, it sort of feels like table stakes today. And I think the pressures and the demands of running a food business today have just completely changed. They've shifted. And part of that is driven by the concept of the modern eater, a more conscious consumer who's expecting more from their brands in terms of climate consciousness, social responsibility, product integrity, community, and experience. So we're going to really dig into that today and hear from these four. But to start the conversation, just going to give a couple stats that I think are really interesting around the concept of the modern eater. So we see new values. 48% of millennials are more likely to buy from a brand if they know the people behind it. And 85% of Gen Z believe brands should be about more than just pure profit. And over 75% of both cite sustainability as important in their purchases. New tastes, I think this is really interesting. International cuisines are over-indexing on growth at 20%. Over 80% of the top 20 largest food and beverage brands debuted prior to the year 1970. And in the year 1970, the population was over 90% white. Today, over 42% of the population is racially diverse. And finally, we've got new habits. 52% of millennials say they prefer shopping online. 36% of Gen Z say they're shopping more now for food and beverage online. And over 69% of both are willing to pay more for great customer experiences. So there's a lot more to consider when it comes to food and eating these days. And so I'm going to turn it over now. I'm going to sit and turn it over now to our panelists. We're just going to go down the line to start, get our backdrop. And, you know, I'd love to hear from all four of you how you see eating having shifted in the past 5, 10 years, depending on how long you've been around. The second half of the panel is new, and how much that's impacted your work. I'm going to start with you, Tom.
Great. So, you know, in the 40 years that I've been in the business, obviously seen massive changes, starting with, I think, people who would go out to restaurants and who were kind of foodies and food adjacent. They were just really concerned about food as maybe a sport or a hobby. And now we've seen a completely shift where, especially young people, they want to know where their food is coming from.
Can we get the
time?
Okay.
Oh.
Is that better? Much better. There's a hum. I hear a hum. No problem.
We could go in reverse, because Abhi,
Yeah,
you might be, do we want to do that? Abhi, take it away.
All right. So I'd say two big themes that, you know, we've probably seen over, and we've been around for about 4 years, so, you know, on the lower end of the 5 to 10 spectrum. But one is, and it might sound obvious, but the going digital aspect, especially when it comes to grocery delivery. So, you know, we're a direct-to-consumer grocery commerce platform. We ship food directly to people's doorsteps. That trend, you know, I know it's talked about a lot in media, but when you look at what's happened over the past 5 years, pre-COVID, it's about 7% of grocery spend was done online. It's $100 billion of grocery spend online, and over the past 2.5 years, that's accelerated from 7% to about 13 or 14%, with the expectation that that's going to double over the next 6 or 7 years. So I'd say that's been a massive trend because traditionally, you know, people would walk into a store, shop for an hour and a half, and you know, spend a lot of time on their weekends doing that. And now, you know, people are buying more online. Online grocery shopping behavior is very different. It's not the same as in-store shopping, and so whereas an in-store trip might take an hour and a half or 2 hours, the average online grocery cart takes 10 or 15 minutes to complete. So how we think about introducing products to consumers, how we think about digital discovery has all shifted dramatically because of that shift online. And I think that the second trend, which Elly alluded to as well, is just the consumer is becoming a lot more conscious about what they eat and why they're eating it as well. So understanding, where my food was grown, understanding the farming practices of the farm that grew my food, understanding sort of like the carbon emissions of the platform that I'm getting my food through, all that stuff, I'd say like a decade ago, mattered to a very small cohort of the population, and now it's becoming a lot more mainstream. And like whether you're, whether you live in like New York and you can afford to care about it, or whether you live in like a suburban and rural market, that matters a lot more today. So those are probably the two big trends that we've seen.
All right, can people hear me? Do I need a mic? Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. Oh, great. I think it's good. Okay, wonderful. So I would definitely say my whole company, Omsom, a proud and loud Asian food brand, is absolutely in response to some of the changes we've been seeing. When I started this company just a couple of years ago, my sister and I were co-founders. We saw that the DNA of this country was rapidly changing, and therefore the diet as well. So a third of the US is now comprised of immigrants and their children, and this group has unmet needs, and more broadly, they're changing the way Americans eat. You're seeing this first in hospitality, and now in food and beverage CPG. So that's really why we started Omsom, is because we saw this renaissance around Asian culture and Asian cuisine happening in the world around us. But then when you walked into the grocery store, we felt like it was really stagnant. We were seeing like stereotypical branding and really diluted flavors. And so that's really why we started Omsom. And there's a whole movement of brands, I think, seeing that same opportunity, that unmet need, and really pushing the envelope, not only in terms of flavors and branding, but also storytelling and content. So absolutely, we're seeing that major evolution in the industry and responding to it through our company.
I'm just going to use this because I have it, and I've always wanted to be a cabaret singer. So I'm Nilu, and I've been a magazine editor for the majority of my career. So I think as an immigrant, I can feel what you're saying, and it's amazing when I became a more senior editor and I had the opportunity to shape what we were going to be talking about at Travel and Leisure, at Epicurious, at Food and Wine. My instinct was, and a lot of our instinct was, to focus on things like France and Italy and kind of the classic palate that we had grown up with. And what's interesting for me in the last 20 years, in the last 10 years, especially after the advent of Instagram, is there has been kind of a confluence of things that has allowed younger chefs, younger food entrepreneurs to echo what they're passionate about. I think we can talk about a lot of chefs who have said, the food that I grew up with is food that I'm proud of. Yes, I trained in a classic French kitchen, but now what I want to do is make an evolved version of the food that gives me joy and the food that gives me comfort. And I think something like social media, like Instagram, like TikTok now, allows a broader dispersal of that. And therefore, back in the day when I was an expert because I was able to travel all around the world. And now I turn on my phone, I turn on my social media apps, and I can get this floodgate of information, and as can everyone else. So the evolution of taste has a lot to do with the evolution of information.
Yep.
Okay, so I've been in the industry for about 40 years now, and when I started out, you saw people that were really interested in food, but more as entertainment. They maybe wanted to know who the chefs were. They were reading the magazines. They were buying, special equipment for their kitchens. And I think we've seen it come completely full circle now, especially with the younger generation, where they care more about food as a lifestyle. They actually want to know who's producing their food. They want to know the effect that it has on the environment, and they want to know that their purchasing power can actually contribute to a company that is looking to do good and looking to do better. And so it's no longer about kind of where are we going tonight to get some kind of crazy special meal. It's no longer, as a chef I say this, it's less about the chef now as a chef in a restaurant and more about what kind of diverse products we can actually create, who's creating it now. But really, really important is that people are looking to spend their money with companies that are actually going to give back, that are going to actually produce foods cleaner, and that aren't doing this just to greenwash their brand, but they really care about the environment and stand by it. I think the younger generation, they'll see right through you. If you're looking to put a product out there and you are looking simply to put a halo around it because you say you're doing some ESG work, that's not going to fly. They're looking for authenticity when it comes to actually, again, who's producing their food and the effects it has on the environment. So that's what I'm seeing out there right now.
That's great. I'm going to turn it back to Avi and Vanessa. As very recent entrepreneurs, you guys both have started your companies in the last 3 to 4 years. So I'd just love to hear how you think about, in being sort of the time of this shift, how you think about your customer journey, how you think about purpose and authenticity, and your value propositions as a company. Maybe Vanessa, we'll start with you.
Hello. Okay. Wonderful. Yes. Okay. So, when we started OnSom, I was 24 and I had just left Bain, so I was really hungry for data. I needed to understand what is the current state of cooking and eating Asian cuisine in the US before I started building anything. And the first thing we did was we surveyed 200 people, we interviewed 100, and we actually watched 50 people cook in their kitchens pre-COVID, and we learned a lot. And one of the things that we learned was that when it comes to purchasing culturally resonant products, folks were always looking for this quote unquote authenticity. And we really pushed them on that because we were like, what does that even mean? And what we learned when we kind of asked like 3-4 follow-up questions was they ultimately cared about who was behind the product in terms of the founders, in terms of the product development and the chefs involved, and who was making money from it. That's really what they valued. And so from day one, OmSom has been all about centering credibility, and that's through telling stories around people, whether that's myself and my sister as daughters of Vietnamese refugees, or all the different chefs that we partner with who are of the respective backgrounds of the dishes that we represent and have built their careers in those cuisines. Because I'm Vietnamese, I can't purport to be an expert on Japanese food and Korean food. Versus I feel like 5-10 years ago, people would just be like Asian food. Like if you're of that background, you can represent any of that. And I think we're taking a very different approach in that regard. And so that credibility lies at the core of everything that we do in terms of the business. And then on the second piece is around community. They also care about who's eating it and who's evangelizing it. So if we're an Asian food brand and the Asian community doesn't feel seen by what we're doing or doesn't feel proud of what we're doing, the modern consumer now is aware of that and says, oh, that brand is not relevant. Their own community doesn't even, stand what they're doing. And so I think for OmSom, we've always been about telling stories, centering our credibility through the people that are involved, whether they're eating our product or they're behind the brand.
Just building off, I think, what you said. So for us at Misfits, and there's a few Misfits folks here in the crowd I see, they've heard these 3 words a million times probably. Our 3 main pillars internally are sustainability, affordability, and accessibility. And ultimately, I'd say every decision that we make, whether it's an assortment decision, whether it's a product decision, whether it's an operational decision, those are the 3 kind of pillars that frame how we think about it. For us, sustainability is at the core of what we do. When we started off 3.5 years ago, we were known as like the ugly produce company. A lot of folks in the crowd might still know us that. We went to farms, we'd go buy produce that wouldn't be sort of like grocery spec for whatever reason. We'd bring it in-house, we'd sell it at a big discount to consumers. We've since expanded that sustainability mission into a lot of other categories. And overall, our view is there is a lot of inefficiency in the food system for a variety of different reasons in every category out there. And we can sort of be unique players and think about the supply chain differently and use that to drive a sustainable outcome to the consumer. The second pillar, which is very linked to sustainability, is affordability. We've always held that grocery e-commerce has been a very expensive proposition for the vast majority of the country. If you live in a dense urban area and you're willing to pay a 30% premium and a delivery fee, you can get access to a lot of delivery options. But if you live in a lot of suburbs or rural areas in the US, you don't really have grocery delivery options. You still have to go drive an hour and a half to the nearest grocery store. And that value piece we thought was a paramount value prop as well. And the sustainability mission is tied to the affordability piece. At the end of the day, what we do on the supply chain side is what drives value to the end consumer. And the final piece, accessibility, we think about accessibility a little bit differently. I think when you first think about accessibility in grocery delivery, what comes to mind is speed, right? It's like, how do I get food in 10 minutes or 20 minutes or an hour? And while we think that's important, our view on accessibility is different. Our view on accessibility is a little bit more around how do you get grocery delivery to folks who have not had access to grocery delivery over the past decade, right? How do you get to the suburban markets, the rural areas? We launched in New Mexico, I think probably about 6 months ago, and we had a plethora of emails come in from customers saying, this is amazing because I live on a Native American reservation, and like the closest grocery store to me before Misfits was a 2-hour drive. And now I can get organic produce and other pantry staples delivered directly to my doorstep. So those are kind of the 3 angles that we think about, and ultimately like all of our customer decision making are driven by those 3.
Amazing. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Tom and Nilu. I can't really imagine 2 better people to comment on, oh yeah, you both have your mics, to comment on just culinary trends and what you're seeing. I thought that was interesting, your point you made about chefs earlier. So what you're seeing in the culinary world and how media has played a role, and probably how the 2 of you have played a role in how people are engaging with the culinary world today.
Sure. Yeah, before I do that though, I do want to talk about, because I've used my platform, my media platform, to actively engage in other companies. And 2 that I wanted to highlight, because I think they're doing things on a large scale. And that's also what's important. You see a lot of companies that are doing things, and they're doing great things. But the idea is, how do you scale something to get it where it's to the masses? And 2 companies that I'm working with are Bowery Greens, indoor farming. Again, they're capturing 95% of the water. Everything is grown indoors, no pesticides, no insecticides, and they're going way past leafy greens. And so they're doing great work. And also another company that I've been working with for 5 years now, and I believe they're new to Baldor, is Do Good Chicken. And the amazing thing that they're doing is taking surplus food that would normally end up in a landfill on a massive scale from supermarkets, reclaiming that food, processing it, and turning it into feed for chicken and for animals. And so our chicken just hit the supermarkets, and really, really exciting because it's being done on a massive scale. And so, again, to me, that's what is the next phase of what's going on. It's a lot of smart entrepreneurs doing really great things, but then how do you scale that up and bring it to the mass? Because that's the only way you can compete with the big sort of brands that have been out there for a long time that are really exploiting workforce and exploiting the environment. And so, to me, that's what's really exciting. Is how do you take this to mass market and do things on a large scale that again are great for the environment, great for the consumer, and to me that's what's exciting right now. And that's a trend that I think is going to continue to grow, because for all of the work that so many people are doing, you have to be successful as a business to keep it going. And so that's always a challenge. It's a challenge in any business. And so to me, that's what's really exciting, is to watch sort of a movement that started by making either cleaner food, making culturally appropriate food, and bring it now to mass market.
Awesome.
Is it weird that I'm going to talk about Tom right now because he's sitting right here? Am I yelling? A little bit, maybe. So I think you asked about media, and I think that the thing that I'll talk about with media as far as magazines is that I think that one thing that media has been really important for is underscoring the importance of storytelling. And that now that I think there are fewer magazine brands out there, kind of classic magazine brands, it's kind of incumbent on food brands to take over that mantle. And I think the ones that I see that are successful, and I'm going to come back to talking about Tom in a second, but the ones that I see who are doing a great job is talking about their sense of community, talking about the provenance of their food, really connecting individually with that consumer through a dialogue that involves storytelling. Now, I'm going to talk about Tom because I think that Top Chef, on the eve of its 20th year,
Wow.
Has had a great impact. And maybe I'm going to disagree with Tom a little bit in that he said chefs are less important. I actually think that what that platform has allowed is for young chefs to come on and be true to their own narrative. And the moments where I'm sure everyone in this room has watched many seasons of Top Chef, where a chef can succeed by cooking their heart and cooking the flavors that they're passionate about. It's not about technique. It is always about technique, but it is really about putting forward a piece of food that reflects them. And I think that actually, if you think about one of the biggest shifts in our world, it's not food for food's sake, it's food for community's sake, it's food for engagement's sake, it's food for cultural connection's sake. And so food is much bigger than it's ever been. And I think some of it it has to do with great storytelling. Tom, do you agree?
Yeah, I think I should qualify what I said. I think the restaurant chef is becoming less important, and the chefs that are out there doing interesting things, maybe not even in a restaurant. Maybe they don't have a brick and mortar, but they're doing home delivery and things like that. They're becoming much more important to the food scene than the restaurant chef.
So we're just going to go back and forth. I do think that is what's been, I think, especially because of the pandemic, where so many chefs lost their brick and mortars. There's so much more creativity in the restaurant space and in what used to be the restaurant space, people creating food brands that never had them before. The downsides of the pandemic have been obviously myriad, but there have been some interesting evolutions of what chefs think they're able to do at this point.
And I also think that COVID was just a catalyst. This was going on before COVID hit, and I think COVID just made so many more people sort of find their side hustle, and then that became their main hustle. But this has been going on for I think the last 5 years, because it's just become too expensive and too risky to open a restaurant. And the biggest barrier for either immigrants and women as well, and people of color, is getting actually funding to open restaurants. White guys like me, it's pretty easy, especially someone with a track record. But that's what's difficult. And so we're seeing that change. We're seeing a big disruption because you don't need millions of dollars to build a restaurant anymore. You can bootstrap a business and do really, really well. And I think those are some of the big changes that we're seeing.
And it sounds to me like, do you feel that there's been some of that celebrity chef gloss has sort of shifted into this new area, probably allowed or fueled by social media, where you can start to see chefs that probably wouldn't have had the chance to be, to create that type of name for themselves before?
Yeah, I think the celebrity's changing. If you were, 20 years ago, a bad boy chef was what was popular. Now, arguably the most known chef in the world is Jose Andres, and he's feeding people in need. And so it's just shifted. The idea of what a chef can be is really, really shifted.
Yeah, amazing. I think very much in keeping with our conversation. Great. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Abby. You touched on this before, but I'm really interested to hear a little bit more about convenience, just because America prizes convenience probably over anything else. And so tell us a little bit about how you guys have brought that into your model, and also potentially some other companies that you think are driving convenience, format, speed particularly well.
Definitely. So, I think obvious statement here is during COVID, online grocery became massive, right? I think the stat was pre-COVID, something like 20% of US consumers had ordered groceries before online at least once. And then, mid-2021, that was 70%. So a massive shift. And I think now that that's happened, the next iteration of this is going to be around convenience and sort of defining what convenience is. And I think there's a few different trends happening. The first one, of course, is in urban areas, speed is starting to matter a lot more. And I think this is not just with groceries, it's with food from restaurants, et cetera. It's with even non-food retail. There's a whole thing now where how quickly can you get it, right? If you're in New York City, can you get food in 10 minutes or 15 minutes or 30 minutes? And I do think that's going to continue to develop as a really important convenience angle in major metropolitan areas. I think what I was alluding to is the convenience we're focused on is a little bit different. Our take is that when you look at sort of, you take a map of the United States and go draw where major grocery delivery services exist today, you basically will highlight all the major metropolitan areas, all the major cities. And then you go to the rest of the country. You go to suburbs that are 45 minutes or an hour outside of major cities. You go to a lot of the rural markets of the US, and delivery access still does not exist. So put aside getting food or groceries delivered in 30 minutes, they don't even have grocery delivery access to start with. Their only options are to go drive an hour and a half to the nearest, large big box retailer. And oh, by the way, once they get there, the selection's very limited as well. Very seasonally dependent. If you're looking for organic fresh produce, you're not going to find it at the vast majority of these places. So the convenience piece that we're really focused on is around enabling access for all of those geographies. And when you look at how our customer base has evolved since launch, we launched in Philadelphia, and then we went up to New York and New Jersey. So our customer base for the first about year and a half of our existence was primarily, Northeast metropolitan customer that skewed a little bit more affluent. Fast forward today, probably 75% of our customer base is in rural and suburban markets. And that's where the lion's share of our business is today. They're ordering large baskets of groceries once a week for predictable delivery on the day that they normally grocery shop. And it's a very different customer than the customer he started with 3 years ago. And so I think that angle of convenience, which is less talked about in the media, when you hear like grocery convenience, you hear a lot about like the rapid delivery, but what's less talked about is like, what about the rest of the country and what about all those other services? So that's kind of where we're focused. To your last point, I think there are a ton of companies that are tackling this in a very interesting way. I also think that most large brick and mortar grocery retailers have also realized that convenience is going to be a huge part of grocery moving forward, and so they're attacking it with partnerships. They're building their own internal delivery services. So I think it's being attacked from a lot of different angles.
Great, so interesting.
I just want to comment real quick. And I'm happy that you said this because I don't understand this thing where, did you forget that your family has to eat and you need the food in 10 minutes? I mean, when did this happen? That you need it that quickly? It's amazing to me. Also, I think this all came really full circle because when I was a kid growing up, and I'm probably older than most people in this room, but my milk was delivered to my house. The butcher would deliver to the house. And so it's all come full circle, but I'm so glad that, the focusing on, I need it in 10 minutes. Like, but again, you didn't forget that maybe you have an ice cream that you need for ice cream. And so to me, it's just crazy, but it's a trend. And yes, I'm the old guy saying, get off my lawn. Yes, I get it.
I'll take that. No, it is an interesting value shift around time and planning and where we put food in all of our other needs of the day. So I'm going to turn now to Vanessa and Nilu and talk about experience, a word we hear a lot about in terms of the digital experience, the customer experience. Would love to hear both of your takes on just what we expect as consumers from our brands and just how that has upped the stakes. Particularly, I think, Vanessa, you'll have an interesting take on this for how you operate at OMSOM.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when we started OMSOM, we definitely zeroed in as experience as one of the main things that could be a lever for us to differentiate ourselves, and specifically offering something that was simultaneously earnest and authentic, but also extremely consistent. So at OMSOM, I can't talk about experience without talking about our ethos, which is basically in our name. OMSOM in Vietnamese means noisy or rowdy or rambunctious, and it's actually a negative word. It's what our parents would use to scold us when we were kids. And we kind of wanted to reclaim that energy and, say, kind of push aside this myth around Asian Americans being docile or submissive and bring this rowdy and loud energy. And so that experience of rowdiness and loudness is in everything that you experience within OMSOM. So whether that's me, telling you a perspective, or you're reading an interview of me or from me and my sister in the New York Times, we're going to tell you exactly what we think. Or it's on our website where there are bright colors and moving pieces, on our packaging, or in our loud and proud flavors. All of it is consistent, and that's the experience that you can come to expect from OMSOM that comes from a very genuine and heartfelt place. And I think that is what consumers want to feel when they're engaging with brands today. They want to know what they're getting, and they want to be emotionally stirred in some way through brands. And I think, at OMSOM, that's why we always center this kind of proud and loud ethos on every front.
The reason that I know Vanessa is a year ago, I was a judge for Foxtrot Markets, and is this working? Yeah. For Foxtrot Markets, where they were picking their up-and-comers, and OMSOM was a winner. And so we got a giant box of all of the best things that had come out in the last couple of years in CPG, and then made decisions. And I will tell you, from the point of view of an editor, from the point of view of a consumer, what Vanessa is talking about is being incredibly laser focused on what your brand is and what your brand isn't, and then echoing that through every single touch point, whether it's the website, whether it's the packaging of how things are sent out, whether it's the design of the labels. Everything with OMSOM is loud. Okay, you want me to stop talking? Loud, loud and proud and thoroughly OMSOM. Another great brand that I think does an amazing job with this experience, from their blog to their branding to their packaging, is called Diaspora Spices, and they're disrupting the spice trade. It's a queer company. It's a small company that has done an amazing job doing what Vanessa's referring to, and whether you're on their website or whether you're making one of their recipes, or when you get the packaging, it gives you joy. It makes it feel like it could not be any brand other than Diaspora. So I feel like we are the most fickle we've ever been as consumers. We were cooped up at home. We have too much stuff coming at us. We're overwhelmed. We're bored. We want stimulation. And suddenly, all of that entertainment and information and responsibility is in the hands of brands. It's a lot of responsibility, but I think the brands that are succeeding are the ones who are over-delivering on that front.
That's great, and a perfect segue to my next question, because I'm interested to hear from Tom and Abby about advocacy. You've spent a lot of your work and time these days around advocacy around hunger, nutrition, access, and just thinking through, I think now there is this interesting overlap of experience and purpose and where brands play a role. So I'm just curious from you both where and how you think business plays a role in furthering and bettering the food ecosystem. Abby, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so we're kind of taking a two-pronged approach to it. The first is putting aside, basically doing our own work independent of any regulatory body or government partnerships, right? And so a lot of that for us is about, how do we expand our assortment to get to a point where, even like very fixed income, budget conscious consumers can have access to this. To my point earlier, like how do we expand geographically and operationally and logistically to get to a point where, some of these very hard to reach geographies that a lot of other companies don't want to go to that we can go to. So a lot of our time is spent there. The other piece to it is telling the story of a lot of our supplier partners. And there's a lot, right? Whether it's like, a farming partner that we worked with since launch, whether it's some of these newer CPG brands that have, values that we want to get across on our platform to the 500,000 people that shop, like that's the other piece to it. The third piece is, I would say, engaging with the regulatory institutions out there that can make some of this possible at a different scale. And I'll preface this by saying, like, it's probably no surprise to anyone here that working with government is slow. But we think there's a lot of upside there. So one area we've been spending a lot of time on recently is snappy BT eligibility for online purchases for grocery. For those of you who don't know, historically, actually not even historically, till now, you can't actually spend snappy BT dollars for online grocery unless it's through a handful of pilot programs that were legacied in over the past like 5 or 6 years. That's changing. Still slowly, but it's changing, and it's getting to a point where there are groups like us that are we work with basically like partners in DC to go and lobby with the FDA and say, hey, we think that there's a huge opportunity to introduce snappy BT redemption on online platforms like ours, and we're working with them. It's a slow process, but that's kind of the other angle of advocacy that we think will have massive impact over the next like decade or so.
Yeah, agreed. In fact, the Farm Bill is coming up. And so these debates are happening. So my activism started from just being a chef in New York. Chefs have always been on the front lines when it comes to raising money, and naturally we were a good fit for the anti-hunger organizations, whether it was Share Our Strength, No Kid Hungry, City Harvest, New York Food Bank, God's Love We Deliver. We were always there. And then about 7 years ago, 7, 8 years ago, my wife was mentoring a young woman. Her family was living in a shelter in New York, and she would come into our house, and it was clear that she was hungry. And a lot of other things happened, and my wife made a film called A Place at the Table that focused on hunger in America. And that gave me a platform to get more involved in the legislative process. And so I co-founded an organization called Food Policy Action. And what we did is we graded Congress on how they voted on food issues, and whether it was hunger, farming, fishing, clean water. And we did that for about 5 years. And we became really known in Washington, D.C. And I left the organization a couple years ago, but that set me up and put me in a position when the pandemic hit, co-formed an organization called the Independent Restaurant Coalition. And we successfully, in 1 year's time, successfully lobbied the government to give our industry $28.6 billion. Now that sounds like a lot, but 300,000 restaurants applied for the grant, and only about 117,000 actually got grants, leaving almost 200,000 restaurants without that money. That put them at a serious competitive disadvantage. But we have an opportunity. We're asking for $40 billion to be replenished into the Restaurant Relief Fund. It just passed the House 2 weeks ago, and so there is a vote coming up in the Senate. So one thing that everybody in this room can do, and you're not going to think this makes a difference, but I know from talking to members of Congress, if they get 6 to 8 phone calls about an issue, they start to pay attention. And so if you go to the Independent Restaurant Coalition's website, you actually click on, you can actually go through to an area where you can click on using your phone number or using your zip code, will bring you right to your member of Congress. You can send them a message, or there's also a phone number where you can pick up the phone and call them. Now this vote's going to happen within the next couple weeks. Senator Schumer has guaranteed that he will bring it to the floor. So if everyone in this room makes a phone call, that could happen. When the Farm Bill is being bandied about, if this program where people using SNAP or food stamps could actually use that to get food delivered to their home. They're not allowed to right now, which is kind of ridiculous if you think about it. Make a phone call. Say you care about this. And you know, everyone has a voice that can be used. And this is important. If you care about issues, it's really important to get involved. And a simple phone call is a very, very easy way to get involved.
Very good takeaway. Yeah, good round of applause. Awesome. All right, I'm going to do a last question and just go down the line of, you know, we're talking a little bit about trends or where we are today and values. If there were one trend that you'd want to see become more of a movement, or one trend that you could accelerate and have happen more quickly to more people in the world of food and eating, what would it be?
Calories are cheap, nutrition's expensive. We have to change that. This is why we see obesity and hunger often in the same family. We've got to find a way to make more nutritious foods more affordable.
Great.
I know you dropped the mic, but I feel like a lot of us on the panel feel strongly that immigrant voices need to be heard, and so diversity, inclusivity, more room at the table for everyone.
Great.
Yeah, and to build on that exact point, I think specifically thinking about who are like quote unquote gatekeepers in these systems, whether that's an investor or a buyer, like you have the power to make decisions, and I think I would love to see a more open mind and I guess some folks listening to what the data is saying around the shifting American palate and shifting resources and dollars and support, whether that's in the form of marketing or investment to brands that deserve a chance to be able to tell their story.
I would say democratizing access to grocery delivery and online, and whether it's more companies trying to tackle the rural and suburban delivery markets, or whether it's the powers that be getting SNAP EBT approval online in general, democratizing online access.
Great. Well, thank you guys all for coming. Thank you to Baldor. This is great.